Good morning. Can we start, please? Yes, we can. So, distinguished members of the court and speakers, dear guests, dear colleagues, today another day ahead of us with 4 interesting presentations, 4 case studies, and the panel discussion hopefully today. As yesterday we have the house full and also colleagues are following by web streaming. By the way, I already heard comments from those colleagues who were sitting in the offices and following us that they really enjoyed the presentations and case studies of yesterday. Today we have new speakers, we have new guests. So therefore I will just repeat a little bit of the housekeeping information that you know that if you need any assistance, there are colleagues waiting outside at the stand over there, so they are ready to help you and answer any question. We have speaker's corner if you need for your comfort. We have coffee corner, and we have Wi-Fi access. Yesterday's agenda was very busy. We had to skip this panel discussion, and you will all agree that it was a pity. So therefore today I really invite the guest speakers to stick to the allocated time in order to benefit at the end of this day with a real exchange in the panel discussion, questions and answers and concluding remarks and so on. So please respect that time. And after reflecting again, we thought that most probably it's worthwhile changing the format of today, and we will have questions and answers immediately after each speaker. So there will be some time allocated for questions and answers after each speaker, and then the panel discussion at the end. So, without further ado, we start immediately our second day, and which will be opened by Monsieur Pedro Serrano, who is a Deputy Secretary General of the Common Security and Defense Policy and Crisis Response at the European External Action Service, and he's been serving since 2015. He was also a principal advisor on external affairs to the former president of the European Council, Herman van Rompuy. Mr. Serrano was also the first to head the EU delegation at the United Nations New York after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. Mr. Serrano has been active in the field of common security and defense policy since 2000, and that's why we're looking forward to your opening speech. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all, and a real pleasure and honor to be here with you and also meeting some old friends. And it is an important moment to talk about security and defense in Europe. I will try to go over the main innovations and initiatives that we have developed over the last 3 years. But maybe my first remark would be to say that this is not just something that we've done during the last 3 years, coming out of nowhere and just to improve the European Union because we think it's the way to strengthen the European Union further. The efforts that we've been conducting in the last 3 years have been, in fact, motivated and pushed by probably one of the most threatening and dangerous international environments that we have been confronted with in the last decades. And if you allow me just to present this quickly, because I do think that maybe we could have a bit of, yes, so I'll just make a presentation about 20 minutes and then questions and answers. So indeed, we are facing one of the most complex security environments for Europe. And not only it is complex, it is at our doorstep. And whether you look to the east with a deteriorating relationship with Russia that you are well acquainted with, and probably I would give here 2 main dates, 2008 with the Georgian War, and 2014 the Ukrainian conflict that continues in Donbass with the annexation of Crimea, that has changed, which is a clear violation of Helsinki principles and the way we have to conduct business, and has really interrupted our relationship with Russia and affected it very profoundly. So that's one front that we have open. Also, you can see how it moves in terms of impact and relations with Moldova, impact in the Western Balkans, and even more broadly, and I'll come to the new geostrategic environment that we're facing at the end. So that's for the East. If we go to the Middle East, and here we have another key date, which is 2011, the Arab Spring, what we called then the Arab Spring. I think a very misunderstood movement on our side. I still wonder whether we understand it enough at present. The war in Syria, and a war that we have considered, and we considered very often as a war in Syria and a conflict in Syria, as it was an internal Syrian conflict. It isn't. It is a major regional fight and struggle for power. And we see this not only in Syria, we see it in Iraq, we see it in Yemen. And we know that in the region, the situation of Iran, situation of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf kingdoms, position of Turkey, position of Israel, with entry into the game of the United States, Russia, and many Europeans, we are facing there a major regional conflict that is having an impact way beyond the Middle Eastern region itself. We have felt this in Europe, and give another date, 2015, with all the movements coming, which were refugees mostly. That was not censorship? No? Okay. Movements of refugees coming into Europe. I think in 2015 we had up to almost 1 million persons crossing into Europe, out of which probably 60–70% were in fact people in need of international protection. But which opened also, once you open a route, even if it's through refugees, you also have then other flows of irregular migration that use those routes. And then we have obviously in 2011 and let's say in the wake of the Syrian conflict, the new, let's say Al-Qaeda version 2 with Daesh coming as a major terrorist movement affecting also directly security of European citizens. But the instability of 2011 not only affected, therefore, the Middle East, which is the other big front that is affecting the security of Europe, it also affected Libya, as you know. And through Libya, which, and you know the state in which we find ourselves also in Libya now, with the most recent developments, but Libya has been unstable de facto since 2011. Has contributed to even further destabilize very fragile regions in the Sahel. And it is therefore also a cause of major concern and a threat also to European interest and to the broader Saharan and Sahelian region, and obviously to Europe. So those are, let's say, the threats bordering Europe. But beyond those threats bordering Europe, we're also witnessing a rise in geostrategic competition. And this is, of course, the usual big powers, the United States, Russia, which I've already mentioned, and the way that, that the relationship with Russia have deteriorated. It is also the rising of China, and with tensions that are taking place in Asia in different shapes and forms, and with an overall rivalry that is affecting as well Europe. And where are we? Where are Europeans on this? Probably the best thing that one can say is that we cannot escape from any of these tensions, and that we have to face them. And that if we look at trends in Europe, and actually maybe the trends of where Europe is can be a bit disheartening initially, because we are in a moment where we're losing population, we are losing overall economic weight comparatively to the gain of weight of others. Technological innovation, if you look at these nice statistics that exist on which are the major informatic companies, Most of them are American, and if not, they're Chinese. In terms of our military might as well, sometimes it is questioned. At the same time, we have and we remain, and if we are united and if we use our power, we remain one of the most considerable actors in the globe. And we're still the second world economy. We are the first trade partner for most of the countries in the world. We have, even in terms of defense, if you add all the budgets of defense of member states, we have the second defense budget altogether in the world. We have the biggest development cooperation in the world, the biggest humanitarian actor. I would say, and if you allow me to blow my own trumpet, also one of the most important diplomatic services around the world, with 140 delegations and powerful structures with, I would also then blow my trumpet a bit more, very competent people. Bit of everything, as in all gardens, but mostly very competent people. So we have all the ingredients to face this effectively. And facing effectively requires, the magnitude and the complexity of the challenges requires many different tools. Not only defense tools, certainly, but also defense tools, because we need to have economic tools, industrial tools, trade tools, development, diplomatic, but you also need defense tools. And I think this is the major awareness of the last 3 years and has pushed forward our ambitious agenda in this field. But before entering into the defense developments, to signal as well that amongst the threats, we do identify threats that are complex in nature, that we qualify often as hybrid type of threats. So the threat is not only necessarily military or military at first. It can come through destabilization, disinformation in various shapes and forms. And here as well, the European Union in these last years has been developing its skills and its tools to identify hybrid threats. And we have, for example, within the External Action Service, a hybrid fusion cell that collates information from all structures within the European Union and institutions, from delegations, from member states, in order to analyze the kind of challenges that our member states or the institutions are facing, and to detect whether they are hybrid in nature, meaning that there is an intent, a political intent of destabilization behind many of those actions or not. And we have developed also tools to respond, diplomatic tools in response, sanction tools in cyber. We have developed our cyber defense instruments as well. The Commission has done quite an impressive work on this. And we are at a moment where we're bringing all our tools together in a much more coordinated way than we have ever done in the past, the Commission and External Action Services. This applies for hybrid, where we have different mechanisms to work together, and it applies even also broadly to the defense sector, where the Commission has now become an important actor in development of defense capabilities, but also when we are acting on the ground, in the field, in many theaters, where we need to bring together security and defense instruments together with development instruments. That's what we are calling the integrated approach. And the final point of additional integration, the internal and external dimension of security, where we see very often as well that we need to act abroad in order to protect our own territory, and that more and more we're seeing how to combine in a more effective way external security instruments like CSDP, Security and Defense Policy, Missions and Operations, with internal security instruments like agencies, home affairs agencies such as Europol or Frontex. So this is where we find ourselves now. Now, what have we done in the field of defense precisely? We've acted in three main fronts. One is development of defense capabilities. And I did mention that we do have the biggest budget probably in terms of defense budget, second after the US, and there is quite a gap, I can tell you. But in terms of investment in production, in technological development, we are lagging behind because we have a very atomized defense panorama, industrial panorama within the European Union. And that we've But we have realized that if we do want to survive and have the autonomy that we need also in terms of development of industry and technological capacity in the field of defense, the only way of attaining this is if our member states decide to work together in developing defense capabilities. And we have put in place, External Action Service Commission, the European Union, has put, member states of course, have launched 3 main initiatives to support this. It's the Permanent Structured Cooperation, which is a treaty instrument, as you know. It is the European Defence Fund and its predecessor, the European Defence Industrial Development Programme. And it is the Coordinated Annual Review on Defence. Somehow these initiatives have been developed, have surfaced in each one on its side, but we have brought them together to ensure coherence, and they only make sense, sometimes le hasard fait bien les choses, they only make sense if you do bring them together and if they work coherently. And this is what we have been doing these years, developing them. And the initiatives were born each one on its own, but we immediately understood that they only made sense and they would have real power if we brought them together. Permanent Structured Cooperation, as you know, which is one of the main initiatives, has 2 main parts. It is about commitment to invest more together, to develop joint projects, commitment to deploy together as well. And in addition to those commitments, to develop projects. And here in developing PESCO, which does not include all member states, it's only those who want to, quite successful, 25 did want to. And so there are 25 participating states in PESCO that assume those commitments, that if they do not respect those commitments can be invited to step out of PESCO. And here we have tried to ensure inclusiveness, so having a PESCO open to all those that want it, while at the same time safeguarding effectiveness, meaning that the projects do not bring the 25 for each project, only those that are really interested in the project and that really bring added value to the development of the project. So we've been able to combine the inclusiveness with the effectiveness in developing PESCO. It is developing well with now 34 projects already underway, a first report on its effectiveness that has just been issued by the High Representative, and that yesterday was welcomed in the Council and followed by a Council recommendation on looking at the way forward, taking note of progress made and what needs to be done to further push it, and bringing PESCO together with the European Defence Fund and the EDIDP. Indeed, the Commission has, and this has been very much a President Juncker initiative, to pursue the field of support member states on defense matters with the aim of achieving a defense union by 2025, or helping achieve a defense union should member states want to follow that track. And the European Defence Fund is a crucial instrument. As you know, in the proposal put forward by the Commission, it would be supporting research in defense and development of defense capabilities up to the level of a prototype. And it should be, and the proposal is to invest up to 30 billion euros for the next financial period, 2021-2027. The research can be funded up to 100%. The other projects up to 20%, but 30% if they are PESCO projects. And we have built different types of bridges. One of the most important bridges is that both EDF and PESCO feed on the same source, which is the common identification by member states of their priorities. And this is what we call the capability development priorities that have been now developed, which will be reviewed cyclically, and that identifies, in following the main areas in the field of defense, what do member states need to produce in order to be effective and to protect their own interest, and also to be able to deploy within the European Union. But it is much broader. It is the defense priorities identified have taken into account NATO priorities, the NATO defense and planning process. So 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 what we're doing here is perfectly compatible, not only compatible, but supports also development of priorities in the NATO field. And all this, again, based on the capability development priorities that have been agreed by member states. And on top of that, we have added another mechanism, and I think Jorge Domecq is coming at some point, so I'm sure he will talk about this, the head of the EDA, well, not head, the executive, chief executive officer, I think it's called, of the EDA. It's the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, CARD, which also on a 2-year basis reviews the defense plans of member states, identifies possibilities for cooperation, and identifies gaps in terms of developing capability development priorities. So this is, I think, one very important chapter of initiatives. Another important chapter of initiatives refers to crisis management and our structures also and capacity for crisis management. The European Union in 2000 decided to develop a crisis management capability with some weaknesses, and amongst those there was the lack of a military command structure. And actually we created a civilian command structure for civilian missions. You know that we have right now 16 missions and operations deployed across the world. 6 of them are military, 10 are civilian. We have a civilian command structure, but we did not have a military one within the European Union. We have OHQs for executive operations that are member states-owned OHQs put at the disposal of the European Union, but we didn't have a command structure within the European Union. Now we do. It is called the Military Planning and Conduct Capability, MPCC, another wonderful acronym. And it is already working, and it will become actually independent from the EU. It's built on the military staff as it currently exists, but it will probably become an independent, not probably, it has been decided, it will become an independent structure at the end of 2020. And it is now also, it has been given the possibility to command as well one executive operation up to the level of a battle group. The MPCC has already been showing its strengths and capacity, notably in the command and control of 3 very complex capacity building missions, the military capacity building missions that we have in Africa. It's Mali, it's Central African Republic, it's Somalia. Very difficult theaters, and for which actually before you only had the force commander on the spot dealing with absolutely everything, which also did not allow, nor for a good management of the missions because he had to be constantly traveling to Brussels, nor feeding lessons learned in a horizontal way to all our missions. So I think we now have improved substantially the way missions are being controlled. And here I want to pay tribute also to General Costarakos, who's sitting at that end of the table, for his great efforts in pushing the MPCC initiative forward. He was really instrumental as chairman of the military committee in making this happen. I'm sure he'll talk about this later. Another initiative on the civilian side is development of civilian. It's the compact, the civilian compact. As I said, civilian missions have become one of important tools that the European Union has. And member states want to see how they can improve the personnel they put at the disposal of civilian missions, better trained, and making those persons more readily and easily available for CSDP missions. And now the compact, which entails commitments in terms of training, but also even changing national legislation to facilitate putting the personnel at the disposal of missions, external missions. It is now being translated into an action plan with very specific different actions to ensure that this happens. So that has been another important tool. And the third and final tool I want to refer to in terms of crisis management building is the European Peace Facility. This is an extra budgetary facility aimed at supporting and financing operations from partners and also equipment, military equipment of partners. And here, first we needed to ensure that if the European Defence Fund becomes budgetized, that we would have a facility that would still allow us to support operations like the ones that we're supporting in Somalia, AMISOM, or even the G5 Sahel, or MNGTF in the fight against Boko Haram, but also to have a facility that would allow us to go beyond the African continent. Who knows? It's true that the African continent is probably where we will most need it, but why put limitations? We don't know what comes around in the next corner. And then we have strong limitations, treaty limitations that you're also, I imagine, familiar with, in terms of financing military equipment. And in order to overcome those limitations, we have to go towards an extra budgetary facility. And this is what we're proposing. So that proposal is also underway. It is being discussed by member states. I hope it will be adopted by the end of the year and will enter into force in 2021. We have suggested 11 billion for the next 7-year period. Of course, member states will be looking at this in the context of the overall multi-annual financial framework, and will be adjusting as they deem fit. Final point I will make, and not to be much longer, is on partnerships. While we do have to be more capable to act, and as I said before, not only through defense means and security means, also through our diplomatic, economic engagement with others, we know, and this has been clearly said in all strategies from the 2003 Solana security strategy till the 2016 Mogherini strategy, that no single state can act on its own in addressing effectively, if it wants to address effectively today's challenges. And even bringing 28 or 27 member states together is not enough, which means that the European Union has to work with partners. It has to do it out of the need to work, because it will be more effective working with partners. Also out of a true belief that it is through multilateralism, through cooperation, through engagement of others, that we will be more effective in the international arena. And therefore, part of the efforts that we have developed in this last years has also been to strengthen relations with partners. And here, one key area when you talk about security and defense is obviously NATO. And with NATO, in the last 2 years, as you probably know, we have adopted there have been 2 co-signed joint declarations at the highest level at NATO and the EU by NATO Secretary General and President of the Commission, President of the European Council in 2016 and 2018. That have given, I think, quite an important push to the development of this cooperation in 7 main areas, including industry, cyber, hybrid, exercises, operations, these joint declarations have been transformed or translated into 74 common actions of engagement. And we have been implementing now at staff-to-staff level these areas of engagement in the last years. Very important in the field of defense capabilities, as I've mentioned, where the European Union has been fully transparent with NATO, explaining what we are doing, and also bringing in NATO inputs to ensure that the capabilities that are being developed within the European Union are also useful for NATO. Actually, not only does the CDP, the Capability Development Priorities of the EU, take into account the NDPP, the NATO defense planning process, but also in the selection of projects for PESCO, the fact that it is a project useful for NATO is also a plus. And so practically all the projects that have been identified in PESCO that are capability development projects are projects that NATO needs as well. Not only there, we're also working with NATO in another important area is military mobility, where, as you know, moving forces across Europe, which is a complex issue. And here we are seeing how through the European Transport Network initiative, which is for civilian uses, we can make use of dual use transport means in order to support the movement of forces. And here again, obviously, the military requirements established at NATO has been have driven as well the identification of requirements within the European Union, and we've been working, and we are working together with NATO on this. Another important area of cooperation has been hybrid, which I mentioned before. Again, nature of challenges has become much more complex, and the European Union has a very wide toolbox in covering areas that go way beyond security and defense that NATO considers very useful. From civil protection, health, environmental crisis response tools, home affairs, disinformation detection and strategic communications. So a lot of different tools. And here we have actually focused the exercises that we have with NATO, what we call parallel and coordinated exercises, precisely on, I have to finish, yes, addressing hybrid challenges. We've also expanded relations with other multilateral actors, notably the United Nations, which is a major partner in most of our crisis management areas, but also with the African Union. And I will stop here, but again, indicating we're doing this not out of interest in developing the European Union for the sake of developing the European Union, but because we find ourselves in a moment particularly critical, and where the common understanding of the challenges that we're facing will be essential in order to help us overcome these difficulties and come out as a stronger union also in the field of defense. Thank you.
Mr. Serrano, I knew I had to stop you and I couldn't because it was so interesting. And thank you very much, especially for this positive spirit in spite of all the challenges you outlined. We have 5 minutes before we have to take you to the airport to rush you. So, colleagues, 5 minutes. Please use the opportunity to pose questions to Mr. Serrano. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Serrano. I would like to put a question concerning this letter that has been sent by the American administration to Mrs. Mogherini and to Mr. Juncker concerning the development and the investment. I think is related directly to the European Development Fund. Could you please give us some hints on this?
Yes, thank you. There's a letter that has been addressed by the U.S. administration to the High Representative, not to President Juncker. The letter expresses concerns that the participation of third states in PESCO, the participation of non-EU entities in programs financed through the EDF, might limit the engagement of U.S. companies in European defense projects, and that this, as a consequence, might have negative effects on even the development of such defense capabilities, because we'd be missing out on important technology, etc. I think a reply is being prepared. On our side, first, to note that while PESCO indeed is indicated as primarily a source of cooperation, a point for cooperation of member states, it opens door for participation of third states, and we're currently discussing that. And contrary to what is done in other countries, including the US, through a waiver system and a Buy American policy, we're not touching any of the procurement rules for defense within the European Union, nor other mechanisms for cooperation. So anything that exists and paths for cooperation with American companies remain untouched. We're creating a new instrument. And within that new instrument, we're even opening doors for participation of others. But instead of just establishing a waiver system, which is totally discretional, we are agreeing on certain parameters and criteria, which are fundamentally based on protection of security interests of the European Union, ensuring security of supply, and which I think is rather a noble cause, and ensuring, of course, that there will be added value in whichever with engagement with the third party as well. So we're working on these parameters now. But we don't believe that there has been we don't believe there has been no change to the policy of cooperation with the US in the field of defense. This is an additional instrument. It doesn't substitute other paths that exist already. Therefore, we believe that the fears expressed by the American administration are unfounded, and we will be communicating this nicely to our American friends.
They are concerned that you
the 5-minute limit.
No. They are worried that you don't miss your plane. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Merci. Au revoir. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir. Bonne continuation.
Merci. So we continue now with Setting the Scene by Professor Steven Blockmans, who's a professor at the University of Amsterdam, and at the same time he is the head of EU foreign policy at the Center for European Policy Studies. And for more than 20 years, the professor has been combining his academic work with research, consultancy activities, and training. So we're very interested to hear the Setting the Scene, please. And if you could leave the time for questions and answers. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me at this conference as what is, for the moment at least, the first non-official on the program, which allows me perhaps to speak a bit more freely in an academic, from an academic background. It's my first time here at the European Court of Auditors, and I'm very pleased to be sharing some insights. I will be shifting gear a little bit and indeed set the legal scene to what I think is the central cog in the defense landscape and the new machinery which Pedro Serrano has sketched out, and that is PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation in the field of defense, which has a treaty basis, Article 46 of the EU treaty, and which in some of the policy-making speeches that I've heard surrounding the launch of PESCO in 2017, I referred to a permanent representative of a key member state, for example, or a parliamentary secretary for state secretary for at the Ministry of Defense of another big member state, in suggesting that PESCO is a legally binding or creates a legally binding commitments. And I think, whereas there's a kernel of truth in this statement, it also conflates the legal character of the PESCO framework on the one hand, and that framework certainly exists, as I just mentioned, and the supposedly legally binding nature of the common commitments that are referred to in Protocol 10, which is attached to the Lisbon Treaty and which deals with PESCO, referred to also by Pedro Serrano, which to my mind is just pie in the sky. So I will focus a little bit on this conflation in order to unravel it and to explain where I think at least the legally binding nature of PESCO lies and how far its commitments go. Now, PESCO itself has, of course, been hailed in heavy rhetoric by Mogherini, who called it a historic decision. In 2017, President Jean-Claude Juncker also tried to take a part of the ownership of the legacy for having waken up the sleeping beauty, as he called it, of Article 46 embedded within the Lisbon Treaty. But political rhetoric aside, I think this nevertheless creates expectations that the EU might not be able to meet. if one considers the legally binding force behind PESCO. I see three challenges in particular. One is the level of ambition, which ought to be derived from PESCO while ensuring its inclusivity. Pedro Serrano referred to the different projects. And even if you have a rather inclusive form of enhanced cooperation where 25 of the 28, or should I say 27 soon, cooperate within a form of differentiated integration within the European Union, the differentiation lies deeper than that, namely within the projects, where the most populated, that on military mobility, brings together 24 member states, but where you look at the 33 other PESCO projects, it rapidly goes down those numbers, which raises a question to what extent, in fact, the PESCO projects might create new rifts or new forms of differentiated integration within enhanced cooperation, and to what extent that stunts the regulatory convergence, the upward convergence that is aspired to within PESCO. I will not deal with this challenge. I will deal with the second challenge to PESCO, which is maintaining credibility. Maintaining credibility in case participating member states do not comply with the commitments that they have entered into when participating in one of the PESCO projects. The third, incidentally, challenge that I see for PESCO is that ensuring coherence between it and the other elements of the other building blocks of the EU's defence architecture as had been laid out previously. Now, as I mentioned, there exists a lot of confusion in policy circles about the legal character of PESCO. I would like to take a two-level approach in analyzing this. One is general, perhaps constitutional, as to EU law. The other zooms in more on the legal character of the supposedly more binding, and this is official lingo used by the Council in its notification on PESCO, the 20 more binding commitments that have been decided upon. First, the constitutional points. Now, in spite of what is sometimes still proclaimed, the CFSP, which of course incorporates the CSDP and PESCO, is not a mere intergovernmental process between the member states. The CFSP rests on parallel competences to those of the member states that conduct their own national foreign policies and security policies. The CFSP and the CSDP are common policies of the European Union, separate from the national foreign policies, and this is, I think, confirmed if you look at the obligation of loyal cooperation on the part of the member states that must support the Union's external and security policy actively and unreservedly in a spirit of loyalty and mutual solidarity. This is Article 24, paragraph 3 of the Treaty on the European Union. Now, PESCO's specific legal basis, Article 46, and Protocol number 10, provide the EU with the competence to establish permanent structured cooperation in the field of defence, which happened by way of Council Decision 2315 of 2017. It is this Council decision that elaborates the treaty's specific institutional arrangements to PESCO, with the Council maintaining coherence and an ambition of the framework and decision-making following the unanimity rule. And the roles and responsibilities of the participating member states, of the European External Action Service, of the European Defence Agency, also of the observers as appropriate, the observer member states, are further specified within this Council decision of 2017. Now, these overarching rules derived from the treaty and incorporated in Council decision in 2017 have been complemented by a set of governance rules for PESCO specifically. And this is, if you want, the second layer of PESCO governance rules in a Council decision of 2018, number 909. Here you'll find rules on modalities to regularly inform the Council about the development of individual projects, and also to allow the necessary oversight, of course, by the Council. It provides general guidance to participants in designing what is called suitable arrangements for the management of each project. And in this context, the Council has also reverted to the issue of coordination functions of participating member states within the projects. Now, although these specific governance rules, procedures and institutional requirements applied to PESCO are significant, they only apply within the confines of PESCO itself, and should therefore be interpreted quite strictly. PESCO's specificity does not take it out of the single legal order of the EU. PESCO is neither residual, meaning it doesn't rely on other competences to apply, nor is it exceptional in that sense. It serves two different purposes. On the one hand, it is a structured form of CSDP in its own right, with its own specific actions, such as capability development, as we've heard, the development of battle groups, actions which need to be coherent with the rest of the CSDP and other elements of the EU external action. On the other hand, PESCO also represents the means by which the EU defines its overall strategic autonomy, bringing different sectoral policies of the European Union, such as research, industrial cooperation, investment, procurement, and trade, under one roof. This is where an interesting link and competence, which is normally associated with the community method and the oversight of the supranational institutions, comes into play, and which makes it interesting, I think, also from the ECA's perspective. So this dual function of PESCO is also backed up by the revision of what was the so-called non-affectation clause of Article 40 in the Treaty on the European Union, which basically prevents the CFSP from being affected by non-CFSP, read other acquis community method legislation, and vice versa. And for any type of encroachment. But this brings, of course, the European Court of Justice in plain sight. Because as a result of the Member States' decision in the Lisbon Treaty to partially lift, if you want, a judicial immunity from which the CFSP and the CSDP has traditionally benefited, the role of the European Court of Justice has indeed become more prominent in this area, especially against the backdrop of incremental integration of the CFSP/CSDP in an increasingly constitutionalized legal order that takes inroads into sectoral policies governed by the community method: research, industrial cooperation, trade, procurement, etc. Now, that said, there's no reason to overstate this point, but simply realizing, I think, that the European Court of Justice is slowly defining the outer parameters of CFSP gradually inward, it seems, and where the former Vice President of the European Court of Justice also sees this as one of the growth areas of jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. Now, second level, with regard to the 20 so-called more binding common commitments entered into in PESCO, undertaken by the participating states and as laid down in a notification of the Council in November 2017, I think the earlier finding about limited judicial enforceability is in fact reinforced. considering at least three aspects. One, the fact that these commitments are entered into on a voluntary basis by the member states. And this flows from the open framework of enhanced cooperation writ large, provided by the treaties, which allows member states to accede, but also to withdraw after the establishment of PESCO. And this key principle is embedded in the notification of PESCO as well. It says participation in PESCO is voluntary and leaves national sovereignty untouched. So the same applies to CARD, the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense. And so the voluntary nature of PESCO presupposes that ultimately there is no legal way of keeping participating states wedded to their commitments against their will. That would be the first argument. The second is that most of the 20 commitments, the ambitious and more binding commitments, as the Council calls them, which have been developed in the 5 areas which are laid down in Protocol 10 to the Lisbon Treaty, they contain insufficiently clear and unconditional language to be interpreted beyond any reasonable doubt, applied and enforced by the European Court of Justice. I'll give you 2 examples. One is commitment number 6, which says that member states, participating states, will play a substantial role in capability development within the EU. Or commitment number 10, which states that the commitment to considering the joint use of existing capabilities in order to optimize the available resources and improve their overall effectiveness. This is not hard legal language that can be mobilized and enforced by the European Court of Justice. So I think it's an illusion to think that breach of these commitments would provide sufficient legal grounds for the court to hold member states accountable. There are political declarations of intent which have been laid down in a notification of the participating states to the Council and the High Representative, which will also be reviewed, as we heard, in 2025. Third argument, the politically more binding nature of PESCO commitments will be ensured not by legal or judicial enforcement, but by an annual regular assessment to which Pedro Serrano just referred. It's conducted by the High Representative. She submitted her first report on the 25th of March of this year to the Council, and it was discussed yesterday in the Foreign Affairs Council, leading to Council conclusions which are sufficiently vague to not name and shame any member states that may be already showing signs of lagging implementing action on their common commitments in PESCO projects, but which is more positive in an encouraging way, basically. So compliance with the commitments relies ideally on increased transparency and in what could over the years perhaps become more annual naming and shaming of member states that do not meet their targets. But under the rules, participating member states that no longer fulfill their entry criteria do not meet their defense spending targets in real terms or fail to honor their commitments, their other commitments entered into under Protocol number 10, will not face any penalties, but only peer pressure, or in the worst case, suspension from PESCO, which is, of course, politically at least a nuclear option, for want of a better word. Foreseen in Article 46, Paragraph 4, but unlikely to be invoked for underperforming countries, to be kicked out of a club in which inclusivity prevails. Even if qualified majority voting among the participating member states would be enough to suspend a PESCO member. So, by way of conclusion, in a system which was initially referred to as a Eurozone for defense, Accountability will, in fact, and enforceability will be very difficult to achieve if unanimity remains the general rule in decision making. And here I note that, in fact, the governance rules on PESCO projects allow the lead member state of each of the projects to change those decision-making rules to qualified majority voting if there's unanimity within the group of participating states per project, which of course could theoretically differentiate the rules on which each of the projects is based. But in general, I think the semester-like CARD system, the Coordinated Annual Review of Defense, unless it is made compulsory, and unless the EDA, unlike the European Central Bank, is not granted any sanctioning powers, I think that Eurozone of defense will not materialize in the way we have seen. So if the lessons learned from the Eurozone crisis are anything to go by, then the credibility of PESCO in the longer run, I would argue, is at risk, especially if a sizable group of member states, say 6 or 7, fall behind on their commitments. And worse, it may leave the EU collective, of course, and this goes back to the opening remarks by Pedro Serrano, it may leave the EU collective, that is the member states and the institutions, unprepared to defend themselves and protect the security of their citizens in the face of tomorrow's geopolitical armed conflict. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to any comments or observations or questions indeed that you may have.
I open the floor for the questions, please. Okay, I understand you keep your questions at the very end of the day for the panel discussion. Okay, so let's thank Professor Steven Blockmans. Thank you. And we go to our next point in the agenda, which is a case study presented by a duet by two people from the French Ministry of Defense. And I understand that you will, yes. While you're preparing, I'll introduce you briefly. Monsieur Joël Lebec started his military career as a commissioner in the Navy, and later he joined the military corps of the Contrôle Général des Armées, and since 2017 he's the chef de cette Contrôle Général des Armées. And also Monsieur Joël Lebec has been an IBAN auditor for 3 years. And I understand that the presentation will be then complemented by his colleague, Monsieur Nicolas Chapon, Contrôleur Général des Armées. You will present yourself.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much indeed for giving us the opportunity to say a few words about our office, which may look a bit exotic for most of you, apart from our very best Spanish colleague from the Intervention. And so I'll try to give you some information about our duties, and after my short presentations, my colleague Nicolas Chapon will address the item of auditing armament programs. So, okay, so this chart shows you quite clearly how complex is the organization of a Ministry of Defense, mainly in France, and you may not show on the right the armed forces, 3 services with the Chief of Defense, Général d'Armée Lecointre. Red zone, the directions in charge, directorates in charge of budget, human resources, legal matters, and the red zone, the green zone, in charge of providing the armed forces with that weapons and systems. And you can imagine that a minister who is taking her duty and mainly with the mission of okay, fine. And is the range okay? I don't know. Well, anyway. Perhaps I'm too far. Yes, okay. Well, so you can imagine that a minister taking his duty, or her duty in our case at present, is with the mission of transforming this Ministry of Defense, is facing a very complex area where, of course, all the stakeholders should and are working together so that by the end of the day the armed forces could fulfill their missions. But let's be honest, there are also competition, views of separate interest, and the minister needs an objective view to inform her whether orders are obeyed, whether the various actions within the ministry are complying with laws and regulations, and if the public money is properly spent. And to help her in this respect, the Contrôle Général des Armées is located over there, so you see that we are only connected with the minister and independent from all the various parts of the ministry. And so, according to the regulation, we assist the minister within the management of the ministry with 3 major points: compliance with laws and regulations, relevance of decisions, efficiency of the results. That shows, by the way, that we are entitled to address not only compliance matters, but also relevance matters, and we may and we are entitled to raise opinions about whether it was proper to take such and such a decision in accordance with the general interests of the ministry and the country. I borrowed this interesting motto from the NAO, help the nation spend wisely, so we are trying to help the ministry spend wisely, so contribute to the proper use by all the parts of the ministry to the proper use of the resources granted by the nation. This point is particularly important because, as you know, the Ministry of Defense has been granted with enhanced resources with these what we call Loi de Programmation Militaire, law for military programmation, and the President said the Ministry of Defense, well, you got more money, but you must be in a position to report whether this extra money you got from the nation, you made a proper use of it. So check whether human, financial and technological resources are efficiently used, and again, a very important item now, help the ministry to overcome obstacles and rigidities that hinder the necessary transformations it has to transform. If we go back to the chart we saw, you see that, and you may guess that there are many sources of simplification in the operating processes of the Ministry of Defense, and in order to have a better performance with a better use of money, some processes must be re-engineered, and of course these plans are facing obstacles and many sources of viscosities, and we are doing our best to alert the minister about these obstacles and rigidities. So what are the minister's expectations now, of course, for any audit body, relevance of work performed on deliverables? We are in some cases embedded as an embedded control tool within some processes in order to raise warnings, and mainly in the armament program field, which will be addressed by Nicolas Chapon. We provide quite frequently the minister with alert notes, warnings, in order to inform her about some problems in any fields, and bringing expertise and objectivity as an actor in the ministry's transformation. The ministry is presently carrying out many major transformations which are difficult to be carried out, and we are in the limits of our quite limited resources trying to bring advisors and opinion in order to say whether these various projects are properly managed. So this is very basic for any kind of audit body, objectivity and independence. So nothing special new in those matters. We are very cautious about the quality assurance process within our business, so that our reports and opinions could be not challenged in terms of accuracy or legal questions, even if the recommendations could be challenged, but it is another problematic. Execution modalities of CJ missions, you see the various parts of our scope: classical audit missions, sectoral control. That is that the ministry is divided in our office in various sectors, and our colleagues are dealing with the sector they are assigned to. Nicolas Chapon is in charge of mainly air and missile programs, audit of armament acquisition programs, IT audit. This is a very important point. We settled now 20 years ago an IT audit capability, which is particularly important in our office. As you know, IT is in any matter, and from an auditing point of view, we have to be able to audit IT organization, audit projects, and also be able to perform data analytics works within our audits, and we are trying to progress in those fields. Armament export controls, weapon regulations, and internal audit mission, because in the French administration there is a policy which aims to settle in the various ministries of our organization the classical internal control and internal audit principles, and we are trying to bring our contribution in bringing some coherence in the various auditing actions which are carried out in the ministry under our ministerial level by the various stakeholders within the ministry. Additional competencies, working regulations and sensitive sites with respect to environment protection regulations. Government commissioners, it is a very particular function. We have 6 colleagues who represent the state in the boards of many firms which are providing us with weapons and war equipments in order to check whether the decisions taken are complying with our interest as a client. Relationship with the Cour des Comptes, of course, preventive check of some organization and human resources regulations and legal text. That means that the legal division or any part of the ministry which wants to issue a new regulation has to forward the draft to us, and we make some observations if some have to be made. and individual right protection with this very specific team, TEMIS, which is in charge of dealing with sexual harassment within the Ministry of Defense. We are present in major decisional instances, so, well, executive committees, investment committee, Ministry Modernization Committee, and other strategic committees. In the two upper committees, COMEX and CME, I am present as head of the CGR. Some of my colleagues are present in the other committees, and I am not part of the decision, of course, as an auditor in these two bodies, but we are providing the minister in objective information, whether the decision which her subordinates are in a position to propose her is robust, to say that, and proper, and if all the risks have been addressed. So our organization is aligned with that of the ministry. To go to the main points, you have these three groups in charge of the forces, weapons providing activities, and legal and financial and human resources regulation. This is the inspections in charge of environment matters. Mr. Chapon is belonging to the group AME, in charge of weapons programs. We are approximately 50 in audit duties and around 100 collaborators, mainly in this field of environment and working conditions regulations in this group, and other collaborators in IT matters or contracting matters. So human resources, we are all officers. It's a second part of a career. We joined the CGR around 35 through an entrance examination. We have also 6 colleagues as contrôleurs généraux en mission extraordinaire. This is this funny terms in the French administrative folklore to say that. They are very, very useful. They are 4-star generals who are assigned to our office and who are leaving their service and bring their experience, and which is quite interesting to mix their experiences and skills. So our action has to be considered in terms of duration, supporting performance and compliance in various sectors. So a question which can rise at this point is, so how far do you go in operational matters, in military matters? So to take a very simple example, 3 years ago exactly, I spent 2 weeks on board the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle and the naval group, which was in Indian Ocean. The question whether it was proper to attack such a target with such a fighter, with such a weapon, was not my business. But whether spare parts, ammunition, fuel, human resources, all the processes which enabled these military operations to be carried out were my business. And of course, we are taking into account and assess internal control and internal audit within the audited organizations, and we are promoting all the principles, and I must stress the very good action of my colleague François Gauthier in that matter, in order to make these principles find their proper place within the ministry. So as a conclusion, it's a unique institution compared to other ministerial inspections. Very few similar bodies abroad except the Spanish intervention. Unique source for the Minister of Objective Information. We are, of course, facing our own challenges. We have to perform and adapt in accordance with present and future transformation challenges as faced by the ministry. That means that we need a permanent renewal of skills in terms of process audit, IT audit, data analytics, any kind of industrial processes which are relevant to audit, and all the tools and methods which enable us to provide the minister with the relevant information for the interest, of course, of the minister, but basically for the interest of the armed forces, because the ministry exists only for the armed forces, and all the big organizations you saw at the beginning of my presentation are at the service of the armed forces, and all contribution with all resources and with all the humility which is required is to check whether all this system is properly organized and operated to make the armed forces in a position to perform their missions. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have at this point any question before I give the floor to Nicolas Chapon, I'll be pleased to answer them.
First of all, thank you very much. Very nice presentation. I have a question to you. How is your relation with the French Court of Accounts, or how do you coordinate your work plan with them? Are there any areas which create conflict between you and the French Court of Accounts? Thank you very much.
La Cour des Comptes does what it likes to do. We, of course, try to coordinate our missions. When the Cour des Comptes performs an audit on topics we already have addressed, the auditors from the Cour des Comptes come to our office and have talks with the controllers who perform this mission. So we are in a good cooperation mind. The question of coordination of audit plans is a pending question. What we should together try to achieve is an audit plan which does not put the audited bodies in a position to have too many audits in a short time. I think that too much audit kills audit. And well, we try to do our best together to avoid these problems.
There's a question over there. Please present yourself.
Thank you, Gerardo Bellantone. I'm the Chief Audit Executive of NATO Support and Procurement Agency. Thank you for your very interesting presentation, and I would like to ask you if you can elaborate and provide some information regarding two aspects. The first one, I would like to know more about the relations with the minister, the reporting lines that the Contrôle Général des Armées has. And the second one would be interested to know if you have a kind of quality assurance improvement program, so which are the efforts of the Contrôle Général des Armées regarding quality assurance, and especially internal or external assessment, if there are any.
Thank you for these two questions. Well, the relations with the minister and cabinet are very close. Our colleagues meet the councillors very frequently. I personally meet the Chief of Cabinet and Deputy Chief of Cabinet at least once a month, and the Minister herself, only she and me, every second month. So we are in a position to have a direct link with the Minister and her team. So it enables us, I think, to really reach our aim to give this as good information as possible we can provide them with. In terms of quality insurance, so we, regarding all jobs, we start with, of course, a letter of mission. 3 weeks after the kick-off meeting inside the Contrôle Général des Armées and with the audited body, we conduct in our office and under my presidence an interim phase meeting to see whether the mission is tracking the good targets. There are permanent cooperation between the colleagues in charge of the missions and other colleagues and their head of group. And a few weeks later, there is another meeting where other colleagues are invited to discuss about the mission and check whether all the problems which had to be addressed had been addressed. And the draft report is submitted to the Contrôle Général Council. It means the head of groups and myself with colleagues. We discuss about the report and some corrections can be made. And afterwards, this draft is sent to the audited authorities in a contradictorial process to make the audited body to give their opinion. And afterwards, we judge whether we should agree or not or maintain our position and recommendation. So it is all quality process very simply described. About the assurance quality, you meant in audit processes. So it's one of the jobs of François Gauthier in the next months in his very specific duty of trying to make good practices adopted by all the specific audit bodies in the various entities of the ministry, whether the good practices are complied with. But there are many, many margins of progresses, to be perfectly honest.
I don't see any further questions, so we can continue. Yes.
Nicolas Chapon, I'm a Controller General in the service that was presented by my chief. In my first part of my career, I used to be an infantry officer, a rifleman. So I try to bring us back to what is an actual defense policy. An actual defense policy is holding a rifle by the right side, being on the right side of a rifle, and who has the finger on the trigger. All other questions are science fiction questions. So, what are we speaking about? In France, we are speaking about 15.5 billion euros yearly budget for equipments, acquiring, maintenance, research and technology. We are speaking about 65 billion euros contract logbook, which are a contracted program, but not paid program. We managed 150 major project portfolio. A major project for us is a project worth more than 500 million euros. We manage other projects, but we focused internal control and auditing activities on this project. And the particular complexity of this area is due to the cycle of the long cycle of procurement assets, 15 years typically, 5 years research, technology, lowering risk process, then 5 years developing the capacities, and 5 years building the capacities, commissioning them, and setting up in-service services. So I will present this case study from the point of view of an internal auditor. Yesterday we heard about some people who were external auditors. We are internal auditors, so the topic for us are different from the external point of view. Our activity is classically driven by a risk assessment. Then half of my activity is aiming at enforcing the internal control of the ministry, of the whole ministry in my sector. The second part of my activity is dedicated to conduct internal audit in my sector. Our risk assessment is focused on the main goals of defense policy. In the procurement, the equipment procurement sector, the strategic goals are to delivering to the armed forces the highest quality, on time and best value equipments. The second strategic goal is to ensure the sovereignty and the freedom of action for the political level. The first principle of the war is to get freedom of action. And the third goal is to maintain at the appropriate level the national and European defense and industrial base, which means that we can accept to pay more for preparing the future. The yearly risk assessment of CGA in the equipment area focuses on the acquisition and support processes, the dedicated structures, and the project portfolio. For example, last year we conducted 9 specific audits as a consequence of this risk assessment. About the support process and the acquisition process, we conducted an audit about the decisional information about the cost of armament programs, an audit about the management of the mutualized budget line for armament, an audit about the retrofit of army equipment coming back from overseas production, an audit about the acquisition via NATO structures. About dedicated structures on armament, we conducted an audit about the human resources of tests and expertise centers of DGA, and an audit about the simulation center of Army. And about the project portfolio, we manage an audit about the Fennec helicopter, about the maintenance of the C-130 Hercule aircraft, and about the lessons learned from the fast-track contracting process of frigate de taille intermédiaire, FTI. I will focus then a particular activity, which is a special commitment in enforcing the internal controls of acquisition and support processes in the whole Ministry of Defense. Because due at the risk at stakes, and we'll remind you the figure I pointed out at the beginning of the exposé, a strongly formalized internal control system has been set up for decades in the whole Ministry of Defense. And this system existed far long before the concept of internal control exists. So we are especially committed to enforce this system. For example, holding a consultative voice in the main governance program committees, which are capacity committees chaired by the Chief of Staff, which decide what is my requirement, financial committee and ministerial committee with voice for my chief. We are committed, for these committees, we firstly check facts before the committees, trying to detect blind spot of project, because often direction of staff in charge of projects are trying to hide the difficulties. So we are committed to detect what they want to hide. And during this whole process, we play the role of the devil's advocate. We must act to voice for minority opinion. When there is a captain speaking before a four-star general, he will not speak about difficulties. So it's my duty to ask a question, but this point, can you say something to me? And this voice, minority opinion. The complexity of this action is that we must to struggle for time, being the last counter appraisal for example, subjects who are presented to the minister sets up automatically in a very hard, very demanding situation in front of time. The access of information problem is not the same that we discussed yesterday. We have the same information systems that armies. We have a very powerful right to access to information. But when you don't know that information exists, it's not possible to ask for it. And last of these difficulties is the complexity of our program because of their duration and the stakes. I will focus then on the main part of my duty, 50% only of the time, but the essential part of what is an internal auditor. Auditing armament project. We conduct our mission in a very classical way with a mission letter which launches the mission, signed by our chief. 1 month later, planning meeting, when I say to my chief how I understand the mission, what are the risks and what kind of investigation I plan to conduct. The core of the audit consists to understand, describing and assessing the actual process, the contracts, the accounting system, and during this phase, we have two rendezvous, especially at the end of investigation. We have a synthesis commission, which is a peer review where we present the main risk we identify and the projected recommendation. At the end of the process, we present our preliminary report to the Elder Council, chaired by Joël, and this council validates the audit and decide how we will conduct the contradictory process. At the end of the process, we make the last report, the the very final report, and this very final report is endorsed by Chief of TGA with a cover letter addressed to the minister herself and pointing out the decision she is invited to take. For instance, 3 years ago, I conducted an audit about the commissioning of two new helicopters, Tiger, which is an attack helicopter, and the NH-90, which exists in two versions, a frigate helicopter for the Navy and a maneuvering helicopter for the Army Air Force, the Army Aviation. Both of these programs delivered exceptional capacities, and our armed forces are totally addicted to these helicopters. But these helicopters, 25 years after beginning, are not achieved. For example, 3 years ago, we still had more than 40 helicopters, roughly 25 Tiger and 15 NH-90, which were not achieved and which need long retrofit operation, some of them lasting today. The maintenance system and the conception of this helicopter are undermined by route misconception. So even if we manage 2 days well this program, this misconception will still make effects for decades. For example, the technical and logistical information system are not relevant. They don't bring us an effective assets. The maintenance plan is very heavy. For example, for the NH-90, you need 30 hours of maintenance for one single flying hour. It is very costly for armed forces, and this ground helicopter for 1 day after conducted a mission, a single mission. And I will point out a very specific topic, which is the type certificate holding and industrial engineering activities. Because in the field of aircraft, there are two topics very critical. The basic question to be able to operate safely an aircraft is to depends on the answering of these two questions. Who is holding the type certificate? Who is the certification authority? The question of holding of the type certificate is very obvious in the civilian sector. We know who is Boeing and who is Airbus. The question of the certification authority is not as obvious. For example, if you study the case of Boeing 737 MAX, the certification authority is not very clear, because Federal Aviation Authority rely on internal business of Boeing, and because of mutual recognition agreement, the European Authority relies on the American one. So who is responsible of assessment of the actual configuration of plane? It's not clear. But in our business of cooperation-made helicopter, for example, for the NH-90, the company responsible for the program is very evident. It is NH Industry. But what is NH Industry? It is a minor subsidiary of Leonardo and Airbus Helicopter. Leonardo and Airbus Helicopter are conducting an actual commercial war, so their cooperation in NH Industry is very weak. But looking at the certification authority, for the NH90, it is a gas plant. We have 19 type certificate, different type certificate for this helicopter, because each nation have his own type certificate, and for primary certification authority, for secondary certification authority. So it takes, for example, 3 years to take a basic decision, for example, to change the maintenance plan. When I joined the audit of aircraft acquisition 5 years ago, the renovation of the maintenance plan of NH90 was a project. It is still a project. For the Tiger, it is very clear because Airbus Helicopter Tiger, which is a German subsidiary of Airbus Helicopter, is a single company without struggling in his board. But nobody, for example, holds the type certificate of the engine. There is no holder, so we don't know who is responsible for the engine of the Tiger helicopter. It is not a very convenient situation to go to the war. Our most significant recommendation about this topic were to make sure that a single actual industrial project management exists. All the words are important. Single, one industrial, actual, an actual industry, not a letterbox company. NH Industry and Airbus Helicopter Tiger are letterbox company. Project management, engineering capabilities. When you ask a question to NH Industry, the questions are redirected to Airbus Helicopter and Leonardo, which are anonymized. It's not clear. Making sure that a certification agency is designated and operational. Then we recommend to contract significant in-service management survey and engineering activities. For example, for these two helicopters, we relied on the religious croyance, religious believing that the industrial will respond to our question. If we want to have a response, we have to pay for it. It's obvious. Then we recommended that when we are obliged to accept the first helicopters under the specification, we must set up a proper contractual disposition, which were not evident for this obvious for this helicopter. And then we recommended to set up relevant information sharing in order to be able to calculate the reliability of spare parts and the size of the spare parts stocks. It wasn't done for these helicopters. The main difficulties we have in conducting our activities are the following. The relevant time. We must act when there are actual activities to be able to check them, but not too late. Not too late to be able to recover the capacity. The second topic is exceptional weight on the complexity of project. For example, the main project in my portfolio, which is the Rafale aircraft, the first contract was signed in 1979, donc 40 years ago, and in my desk I hold the 365 contracts for Rafale aircraft. The third complexity for us is the international agencies on United Nations foreign military sales, black boxes. These black boxes function. We put €1 billion at the input, and at the output we have frigates, missiles, and other assets. But these agencies are black box for an internal audit point of view. I suppose there exists a link between our €1 billion and the deliveries. I think that Mr. Guillaume Bigot knows this link, but nobody in the French MOD is able to explain me this link. It's a religious believing that there is a link between the two questions. And I will conclude with the main shortfalls of our armament program. First of all, the mismanagement of international program. I am not in a science fiction world. I can only check the actual armament program, and the situation is not very. I'm not very optimistic when I observe and check this situation. The second shortfall is an internal French problem, which is the internal under-evaluation cost. For example, our staffs and sometimes our armament directorate prefer to not present all the costs in order to securize the political decision. Third, especially in France, where we try to be autonomous and to develop our own armament system and to maintain our DTIB, there are lots of monopolies, and when you negotiate a contract with a monopoly, you are not in a strong place. And the last difficulties of our armament program is that there are always political pressure to engage over budget, and at the end of the year, the yearly traditional cuts in our defense budget, then we must to go back on the negotiation table with the industrial part, and then the industrial say yes, we can divide by two the goal of the program, but the price will be perhaps 10% less. And I'm subject to your question.
Is there any question? Yes, please. Please present yourself.
Wiesław Kurzyca, Poland. I would like to ask, it's more general than just specifically to this project. What is your approach and method of developing the criteria when you make the risk assessment, when you start the audit of the procurement project, and when you then finally evaluate the results?
For the risk assessment, I don't speak for the global risk assessment of our service, but in the armament area, my primary input is the global amount of money at stake. So I have a basic table with the stock of contracted commitment, the annual budget, and the criticism regarding the operational topics, the operational goals. Then it is not a very well instrumented process. It's a question rather of self-evaluation and the discussion each other from one bureau to another.
If I may add something, as you can imagine, more or less every kind of armament program is a unique problem and project with its own risks and targets and aims. Of course, our colleagues are asking themselves the basic questions: will this project will bring in due time within the fixed budget the equipment with specifications which are being asked for. And according to these three basic requirements, our colleagues assessing the way the project is conducted, how the armed forces are discussing with the DGR, how the DGR is discussing with the industry, how the whole management process is carried out. They identify some risk sectors and focus on these risk sectors. Cost under assessment, for example, lack of human resources, complexity or inaccuracy of the operational need are, among others, the points which are addressed by our teams.
We'll take only one more question. Mr. Metzger, you wanted.
Thank you. Well, I had two questions, but I put the two questions, and if we're short of time, you just pick the one you prefer. The first one is about what you describe as enforcing internal control systems. Well, the fact that the Contrôle Général takes an active, although a consultative part in program governing bodies, don't you see a conflict of interest with your mandate as an internal auditor when it comes to auditing the internal control systems as the auditor? So that was the first question. Second question, and as I said, you pick the one you prefer, was about looking for your door key under the street light rather than in the dark. You say, we don't always know that an information exists, so we have to go for information about the information. Question is, do you and how welcome whistleblowers in the discharge of your duties?
Well, for the first question, it is a very interesting question we put ourselves all the time. And of course, when we discuss with colleagues from internal audit within industrial groups or with Cour des Comptes or other bodies, this question comes always. So you are involved, but are you really involved in some management processes? And so are you still independent in your auditing purpose? So the question is to see our colleagues in their duties as sectorial auditors, as censors, if I may use this word. So they attend committees, they look into files, and they are not part of the decision, but they raise questions. They do not say, I think that this should be decided, but they usually say, did you consider that problem and how did you manage it? And if the answer is not satisfactory, they write alert memo we send to the minister. So it means also very interesting in the process of building our annual audit plan, because all our colleagues observing the function, the operation of the ministry are in a position to be alerted by some weaknesses and deficiencies in their daily work and propose an audit item. The second question was whistleblowers. We have some. It is not officially installed, if I could say, in the Ministry of Defense, as in any of our ministries in France. But some people want to speak with us discreetly to tell us some informations. About the point of access to information and the difficulty of knowing what kind of information exists. It was stressed by the minister herself in a new instruction in May last year that we are entitled to plug ourselves to any kind of IT system and documentation systems or mailboxes. So it is not so well accepted by the audited entities, as you can imagine, but every time it is proper and necessary, we just plug on files and see what kind of documents have been issued in the topic we are auditing. Are you happy with my question, with my answers, my dear?
Well, you can continue over coffee, yeah, discussion that. So on behalf of everyone, we thank you cordially, Monsieur Joël Lebec and Nicolas Chapon, for allowing us to have a glimpse into a very secret world, and also of the Ministry of Defense of France. So it's not every day that we have that. So thank you very much. The coffee break, 15 minutes. Please be 11:20 on time. Thank you and see you.